Imagine a world without filing cabinets, without legal contracts, without any written records at all, where the entire fabric of society, everything from laws and land, rights to the deepest loyalties between people, depended not on paper, but on stories. Stories told and retold, shaped and polished over generations, carrying within them the very codes that held civilization together. This wasn't some distant fantasy. This was the reality of life in medieval Europe. In an age long before widespread literacy, communities relied on a powerful and sophisticated system of memory, one built not on ink and parchment, but on narrative. Storytelling was far more than mere entertainment. It was a vital technology, a living, breathing archive that preserved the most essential knowledge a society could possess. Think about that for a moment. How would you remember the precise boundaries of your family's land across 5 generations? How would you recall the complex laws governing trade, marriage, or justice without a single law book to consult? The answer lies in the art of the story. Medieval people mastered this art. They wove crucial information into the very DNA of their tales, into epic poems chanted at feasts, into family sagas recited around hearths, into the rhythmic verses of bards and skalds. These stories became vessels, carrying everything from legal precedents and property lines to the sacred bonds of loyalty between lords and their followers. They were memory made manifest, a collective hard drive built from words, emotion, and communal repetition. What we're about to explore is nothing short of a lost world of wisdom, a medieval memory code that allowed societies to flourish against all odds. We'll journey together to uncover how ordinary people accomplished extraordinary feats of recall, how a well-told story could prevent a war, settle a dispute, or unite a community. From the rolling hills of Ireland to the fjords of Norway, we'll see how narrative shaped reality itself, creating a durable bridge between the past and the present. This is a story about stories, and by the end of our time together, you'll never look at a tale or the power of human memory the same way again. So settle in, and let's begin unraveling the secrets of how storytelling built the foundations of law, land, and loyalty. To truly grasp the scale of this achievement, we have to step into a mindset almost foreign to us today, a world where the human mind was the primary storage device for an entire culture's most vital information. This was not a matter of simply remembering a few family tales. It was a highly disciplined, systematic practice. In the absence of pen and paper, societies developed what we might call an oral architecture, a framework built specifically to support the weight of immense amounts of knowledge across generations. The key architects of this system were the specialized keepers of memory, the elders who held the wisdom of the community, the bards who sang of its history, and the griots of other traditions who could recite genealogies that stretched back for centuries. These individuals were not merely repositories, they were active, living databases trained from a young age in sophisticated mnemonic techniques. The methods they used were ingenious, turning dry, complex data into something dynamic and memorable. Rhythm was a fundamental tool. By setting information to a steady, predictable beat, the mind could latch onto the pattern, making long recitations far easier to memorize and recall. Think of it like the way a catchy song lyric gets stuck in your head. That's the power of rhythm at work. Alliteration, the repetition of initial consonant sounds, added another layer of stickiness. In Old English, for example, a law might describe a penalty using a string of words beginning with the same sound, creating a verbal chain that linked each concept to the next. Repetitive structures provided a familiar framework, signaling to both the speaker and the listener where they were in the narrative, much like the chorus of a song, brings us back to a central theme. We can see this system operating with brilliant clarity in places like Anglo-Saxon England. Here, the law was not a silent text on a page, it was a public performance. At a moot, a communal gathering, a designated speaker would stand and recite the law code in a clear, poetic cadence. This was a practical necessity. By proclaiming the laws aloud, the community ensured that every free person, whether they could read or not, understood the rules that governed them, their responsibilities to their lord, and the compensations owed for specific injuries. This act of public recitation did more than just inform. It ritually reaffirmed the social contract. Everyone heard the same words at the same time, creating a shared experience that reinforced a collective identity and a common set of values. The story of the law became part of the story of the people. This intertwining of the practical and the symbolic is what elevated oral tradition from a simple memory aid to the very bedrock of society. Storytelling was the thread that wove together the mundane details of land boundaries and the lofty ideals of honor and loyalty. A tale about a legendary hero wasn't just for inspiration. It might subtly encode a precedent for resolving a dispute or define the acceptable limits of a king's power. The story carried the rule within its heart, ensuring the lesson was remembered not as an abstract decree, but as a vivid, emotional narrative. This seamless blend is what made the system so resilient and effective, allowing culture, law, and identity to flow effortlessly from one generation to the next, long before a single word was ever written down. But these keepers of memory were not operating alone in the shadows. They had their star performers, the master craftsmen of the spoken word. Stepping into the firelit halls of chieftains and kings, we find the bards and the skalds. To call them mere entertainers would be like calling a master architect a simple bricklayer. In Celtic societies, the bard was a figure of immense prestige, a member of the learned class who trained for years to hold his position. Across the North Sea, the Norse Scalds were equally revered, their words capable of making or breaking a leader's reputation. They were, in the truest sense, the living hard drives and the public relations departments of their time, the official custodians of a community's most precious assets, its history, its laws, and its very identity. Their toolkit was poetry, but not poetry as we often think of it today. This was a highly technical, structured form of verbal engineering designed for one primary purpose: unforgettable recall. They mastered complex poetic forms like the Drottfeet meter used by Scalds, which employed a strict pattern of syllables, alliteration, and internal rhyme. This wasn't just for artistic flair. The rigid structure acted as a mnemonic cage, locking the information into a specific and unchangeable form. A single misstep in recitation would break the rhythm and the rhyme, signaling an error to everyone listening. This ensured an incredible degree of accuracy across countless retellings. Then there were the kennings, those ingenious metaphorical compounds. A simple sword wasn't just a sword, it was a battle snake or a wound hoe. The sea was the whale road. These evocative phrases did more than just paint a vivid picture. They compressed complex ideas into memorable, almost puzzle-like packages that engaged the listener's mind on a deeper level, making the information stick. Now consider the practical application of this art. An Icelandic saga might seem on the surface to be a thrilling tale of adventure and feud, but woven into the narrative are meticulously detailed descriptions of property. A boundary dispute between two families wouldn't be settled by producing a deed. It would be resolved by a skald reciting a passage that described the land in question. The narrative might follow a hero walking the border. He strode from the driftwood stone 10 paces south to where the old ash tree stands, split by lightning. then westward along the ridge until the stream bends sharply below the two hills. This wasn't just poetry, this was a legally binding description, encoded in a story that was far more memorable and far harder to fraudulently alter than a simple list of landmarks would ever be. The performance itself was a masterclass in community psychology. When a skald stood before a chieftain's retinue at a feast, his story was a powerful political tool. By recounting the glorious deeds of the chieftain's ancestors, the skald was not just flattering his host, he was publicly validating the chieftain's right to rule, grounding his authority in a legacy of heroism and wisdom. Simultaneously, for the warriors and followers in the hall, the tales of loyalty and sacrifice reinforced their own social obligations. This was an interactive experience. The audience's cheers, their boos, their stunned silences were all part of the performance, a collective and emotional reaffirmation of the social codes that bound them all together. The abstract concept of fealty became the heart-wrenching story of a warrior defending his lord to the death. The dry legal principle of inheritance right became the triumphant saga of a rightful heir reclaiming his father's land. In this way, the bard and the skald were architects of reality. Their stories didn't just reflect the world, they actively shaped it, reinforcing governance, legitimizing power, and maintaining social order through the irresistible power of a well-told tale. Their influence extended from the drinking hall directly to the Thing field, where laws were made and disputes settled. They were the vital link between the abstract rules of society and the hearts and minds of the people who lived within it, proving that the most powerful law book ever written was not made of parchment, but of memory and song. So how exactly did these master storytellers pack so much vital information into a tale and ensure it stuck for a lifetime? They became architects of the mind, employing a sophisticated toolkit of mnemonic devices, mental shortcuts designed to make the intangible permanently tangible. Perhaps the most powerful of these was the method of loci, an ancient technique often called the memory palace. This involved associating every piece of information you needed to remember with a specific, familiar location, like a well-known path through the woods or the layout of your own home. A storyteller wouldn't just list the terms of a land grant. They would take you on a mental walk, embedding each clause into the landscape itself. The giant oak tree at the edge of the field wasn't just a tree, it marked the point where grazing rights for the village common began. The large, flat river stone signaled the annual tribute of 2 sheep owed to the local lord. By tying abstract legalities to physical, unforgettable landmarks, the story created a cognitive map that listeners could walk through in their minds again and again, effortlessly retrieving the information anchored to each spot. Beyond the landscape of the story itself, the very sound and structure of the language were engineered for recall. Listen to the opening lines of an epic like Beowulf, and you're immediately struck by the pounding, rhythmic alliteration. H-wheat we gardena in Geardagum Theodsoninga trim Jeffronen. That repetition of the G and thorn sounds isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a cognitive hook. This rhythmic, repetitive quality acted like the chorus of a song, creating a predictable pattern that made vast swaths of text easier to memorize and recite accurately. Rhyme served a similar purpose, creating auditory cues that signaled what came next. For a culture that relied on hearing and speaking rather than reading and writing, these sonic patterns were essential. They turned a complex legal code or a lengthy genealogy into a kind of music, where the melody of the words helped carry their meaning deep into memory. The organization of the narratives themselves was another layer of this ingenious design. Stories were rarely told as single, standalone events. Instead, they were organized into cycles or episodes, each one functioning like a chapter in a larger manual of social conduct. The Arthurian legends are a perfect example. You wouldn't hear just one story about King Arthur. You would hear a cycle of tales, each episode highlighting a different facet of the chivalric code. One story might focus on the proper conduct for accepting a challenge to single combat, carefully encoding the rules of engagement and the consequences for treachery. Another might explore the complexities of land grants bestowed for military service, detailing the obligations of the knight who received that land. Yet another would serve as a parable about loyalty, using the betrayal of Mordred to illustrate the catastrophic fallout of broken oaths. This episodic structure allowed a community to absorb its laws and values piece by piece, in a digestible and highly engaging format. What made this entire system so brilliantly effective was its multi-sensory and emotional engagement. A dry list of rules is easy to forget, but a vivid story about a knight facing a moral dilemma, set against a landscape you can visualize, told with a rhythm you can feel, and culminating in a powerful emotional resolution. That becomes unforgettable. The medieval memory code didn't just target the intellectual part of the brain. It targeted the sense of place, the ear for music, and the heart that feels justice and injustice. It transformed cold, hard facts into warm, living experiences. This understanding of human cognition centuries before modern neuroscience reveals a profound ingenuity. They knew that for knowledge to endure, it had to be woven into the very fabric of story, making memory not a chore, but a natural and enduring part of life itself. But how exactly did a story transform into a binding legal precedent? Let's bring this down from the epic scale of sagas to the very practical matter of a broken arm or a stolen cow. In a society without police forces or public prosecutors, the entire system of justice relied on communal agreement and the threat of social ostracization. The law, therefore, had to be known by everyone, and nothing made it more universally accessible than a good story. Imagine a local dispute erupting over an injury suffered during a boar hunt. The injured party claims the other hunter was reckless. The accused claims it was simply an accident. There's no written penal code to consult. Instead, the village elder rises and begins to speak. He doesn't quote a statute, he tells a tale. He recounts a story from generations past, a strikingly similar incident where a man was gored because his companion failed to shout a proper warning. The outcome of that ancient story, perhaps a payment of 2 sheep and a bushel of barley to the injured man's family, becomes the living precedent for resolving the current conflict. The story provides a complete framework. It establishes fault, defines the concept of negligence, and prescribes a restitution that feels fair and proportional, all wrapped in a narrative that everyone can understand and remember. The Norse Sagas laws, one of the most extensive medieval legal codes we know of, offer a brilliant window into this process. While they were eventually written down on calfskin in Iceland, they originated and lived for centuries as an oral tradition, a collection of narratives and case studies recited by the law speaker at the Althing, the National Assembly. These weren't dry legal pronouncements. Each law was a story in miniature. A regulation concerning property damage might be embedded in a tale about a neighbor's stray cattle trampling a barley field. The narrative would vividly describe the scene, the anger of the farmer, the excuses of the cattle owner, and the intervention of a respected third party who brokers a solution. Perhaps the offending farmer must work the fields of the other for a full moon cycle. This story-based format did more than just state a rule. It illustrated the entire process of conflict resolution, from the initial grievance to the restored harmony. It emphasized the core Viking values of fairness and, crucially, reciprocity. The solution wasn't about punishment for its own sake, but about restoring balance to the community. This method of encoding lore had a profound democratizing effect. You didn't need to be a literate scholar to know your rights and responsibilities. You just needed to listen to the stories told at the fire. These narratives covered the entire spectrum of life. They detailed the exact weregild or man price for every conceivable injury, from a lost thumb to a fatal wound, making the complex mathematics of human worth common knowledge. They spelled out the rituals of a binding contract, perhaps a marriage agreement or a trade deal, by telling the story of a past agreement that was honored and one that was broken, along with the very different consequences for each. This turned abstract legal principles into tangible, real-world examples. A young man learning about his duty to his family wouldn't be given a lecture. He would hear the tragic story of a son who abandoned his kin and lost his honor and inheritance as a result. Perhaps the greatest strength of this story-based legal system was its inherent flexibility. A written law is fixed. It can be rigid and slow to adapt to new circumstances. But a story is a living thing. A skilled storyteller or judge could slightly adjust a familiar tale to fit a novel situation, perhaps introducing a new character or a different type of property, while still upholding the core principle of the original narrative. This allowed the law to evolve organically alongside the community it served, all while maintaining a powerful sense of continuity with the past. The emotional resonance of these tales, the outrage at a betrayal, the satisfaction of justice served ensured that the lessons weren't just memorized, they were felt. This fusion of narrative and law didn't just create a system of rules, it cultivated a shared legal consciousness, a common understanding of right and wrong that was woven into the very stories people told about themselves. It was a living, breathing legal system, as dynamic and complex as the community it held together. And it wasn't just laws governing personal conduct that were preserved in this narrative web. The very land beneath people's feet, the most tangible source of wealth and identity, was also defined and defended through the power of story. In a world without title deeds, satellite maps, or property registries, how did you prove that a particular meadow, forest, or stretch of coastline belonged to your family and had for generations? The answer lies in the epic tales and local legends that were recited at communal gatherings. These stories did more than just entertain. They served as living, breathing legal documents, meticulously encoding the boundaries of the world people knew. A saga wouldn't just mention a forest. It would describe its exact perimeter by weaving a hero's journey along its edge, noting the ancient, gnarled oak at the northern corner, the fork in the river to the west, and the distinctive trio of standing stones marking the southern limit. These weren't casual descriptions, they were legally precise territorial claims, set to a rhythm that made them impossible to forget. We find a beautiful example of this in the Irish tradition of the Dinnseanchas, a vast collection of poems whose very name means the lore of place names. Every hill, every valley, every stream had a story that explained its name and, by extension, its significance. A poem about a place called the Red Ridge wouldn't just say it was named for the color of the soil. It would tell a tragic tale of a great battle fought there, where the blood of fallen heroes soaked the earth, permanently staining the ridge and giving it both its name and its sacred status. Another might explain a cluster of rocks in a river as the petrified remains of a giant thrown there by a mythical hero. These stories transformed the entire landscape into a vast, open-air library of history and lore. To know the story of a place was to understand your connection to it, your rights over it, and the historical events that had sanctified those rights. Reciting the Dinnseanchas for a disputed parcel of land wasn't just sharing folklore. It was presenting evidence in a court of oral tradition, where the most compelling and widely accepted narrative could determine ownership. The recitation of these stories was often part of a larger, more physical ritual designed to sear the knowledge into the community's collective memory. In many cultures, there was a practice known as beating the bounds or walking the boundaries. Once a year, often during a festival or important communal meeting, the entire village would participate in a walking tour of their shared territory. At the head of this procession would be the elders or the designated storyteller. At each significant landmark, a particularly old tree, a large boulder, a bend in a creek, the procession would halt. The storyteller would then recite the specific part of the saga or poem that pertained to that exact spot. For a young child, it might seem like a fun story about a ghost or a giant. But for the adults, it was a critical civic lesson. They were witnessing the living map of their world being activated. As they heard the story of the battle at the ridge while standing on that very ridge, the narrative and the geography fused into one indelible memory. This ritual reinforced the legitimacy of the claims on an annual basis, preventing any slow, creeping encroachment or the erosion of knowledge across generations. Anyone tempted to move a fence line would have to contend not with a piece of paper, but with the entire village's shared memory, reinforced by story, song, and direct experience. This intricate system turned the landscape itself into a mnemonic device of breathtaking scale. A mountain wasn't just a geological feature, it was the sleeping form of an ancient king. A peculiar rock formation was the remains of a giant's cooking pot. A quiet pool in a stream was where a water spirit was said to dwell. Every feature was a bookmark in a gigantic natural storybook. To travel across the land was to literally walk through the stories of your ancestors. This created an incredibly deep and emotional connection to the territory. It wasn't merely property to be owned, it was a legacy to be understood and protected. The land held the stories, and the stories gave the land its meaning and its value. This connection between narrative and territory highlights the stunning practicality of the medieval memory code. It wasn't an abstract intellectual exercise. It was a vital technology for survival, for maintaining order, and for preserving a people's identity, transforming the whole world into a map of memory where every hill, every stone, and every river whispered the stories of the past. But these stories were far more than simple moral fables. They were the essential operating manuals for the complex and perilous world of feudal obligation. In a society built not on the rule of impersonal law but on the strength of personal bonds, the concepts of loyalty and fealty were the very bedrock of order. A lord's power depended entirely on the oaths of his sworn men, and a vassal's safety and status hinged on the protection of a reliable lord. This was a fragile, human system, vulnerable to ambition, fear, and misunderstanding. Heroic narratives stepped into this breach, serving as powerful, emotionally charged blueprints that showed everyone from the highest king to the lowest foot soldier exactly how this system was supposed to work and what happened when it failed. Consider the visceral gut punch of a story like the Song of Roland. Here, we don't just hear about loyalty in the abstract. We witness Roland, Charlemagne's nephew, facing certain death at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. His pride prevents him from blowing his oliphant to call for help until it is far too late, a decision that leads to the annihilation of his entire rear guard. The story doesn't shy away from this fatal flaw, but it ultimately frames his death as the ultimate act of feudal devotion. He dies defending his lord's army and his lord's honor, his final act one of prayer for his emperor. His story becomes the gold standard for military loyalty, a terrifying and tragic lesson in the absolute extremes of duty. Conversely, the Nibelungenlied offers a sprawling, dark tapestry of what happens when these bonds unravel. The catastrophic betrayal and slaughter that defines the epic all stem from broken oaths and fractured loyalties. painting a horrifying picture of a society consuming itself from within when the sacredness of one's word is abandoned. The performance of these tales was a masterclass in communal reinforcement. When a skilled bard recited these epics in a crowded great hall, he wasn't just telling a story, he was conducting a ritual. As he reached the moment where a hero like Roland makes his fateful choice, you can imagine the entire room leaning in, feeling the weight of that decision. The collective gasp at an act of betrayal, the approving nods during a speech about honor, these were not passive reactions. They were a form of active participation, a public and emotional recommitment to the values being dramatized. For a young knight listening, the story provided a clear script. This is how a true man behaves. This is the glory that awaits the faithful. This is the shame and ruin that befits the oath breaker. It made the abstract contract of fealty something you could feel in your bones, the thrill of loyalty rewarded, and the cold dread of treachery punished. This narrative reinforcement was absolutely crucial for maintaining stability. In the absence of a strong central government or a standing army, a lord's authority was only as solid as his reputation for rewarding loyalty and his ability to inspire fear in those who might betray it. These stories were a primary tool for building that reputation. A lord who patronized Scalds to sing of his own or his ancestors' generous deeds and unwavering commitment to his followers was engaging in a powerful form of soft power. He was advertising his quality as a leader, encouraging loyalty from his current men and attracting new, ambitious warriors to his banner. The stories created a cultural currency where honor was the most valuable commodity and your word was your most binding possession. This wasn't just about controlling people, it was about creating a predictable and functional society where everyone understood their role and the profound consequences of stepping outside of it. The power of these narratives truly extended far beyond the entertainment of a knight's feast. They were the invisible architecture that held the fragile world of feudalism together, shaping alliances, guiding behavior, and giving a dangerous and uncertain world a much-needed sense of order and meaning. Beyond the battlefield and the council hall, in the very definition of a person's place in the world, lay the critical importance of bloodline, your identity, your rights, your potential for power. All of it was rooted in who your ancestors were. In a kinship-based society, genealogy was far more than a hobby. It was the legal and social operating system. But without birth certificates or public records, how did a society keep track of these vital lines of descent across centuries? The answer, once again, was found in the power of a well-crafted story. Bards and skalds were the keepers of these living family trees, and they understood that a simple list of names would be forgotten by the next morning. Instead, they wove those names into the rich tapestry of epic narratives, transforming a dry genealogy into a thrilling saga of origin and destiny. Imagine the scene at a royal court or a chieftain's hall. A visiting skald is called upon to honor the host. He doesn't merely begin with the current ruler. He starts at the very dawn of time, connecting the man sitting before him to a legendary past. The recitation would be a masterful blend of fact and myth, a rhythmic cadence of names, each one accompanied by a snippet of story. He wouldn't just say, "and his father was Woden." He would say, "and from the line of Woden, the god who gave his eye for wisdom, came the strength that now fuels your arm in battle." This wasn't just flattery, it was a profound act of legitimization. A text like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is filled with these genealogies, tracing the lineage of kings like Alfred the Great back through legendary heroes like Scyld Seefing, all the way to the pagan god Woden himself. By anchoring a ruler's authority in a divine or heroic ancestry, the storyteller was providing a powerful answer to the question, why should this man rule? The answer was in his blood, a story written in his very being and recited for all to hear. These narratives were anything but boring. A skilled bard would highlight the most dramatic moments in a family's history, turning a lineage into a series of unforgettable episodes. The recitation might pause at a famous ancestor who won a great battle against impossible odds, his name forever sung in poetry. It would linger on a strategic marriage that brought two powerful families together, sealing an alliance that defined the region for generations. It would mourn a tragic death that sparked a vendetta, a story that explained a long-standing feud. Each name was a bookmark to a larger story, and by linking the present lord to these pivotal events, the bard was doing more than recounting history, he was defining character. He was implying that the courage of the warrior ancestor flowed in the veins of the current leader, that the wisdom of the shrewd marriage maker guided his current decisions. This created a powerful sense of social continuity, assuring everyone that the present was a direct and honorable extension of the past. The practical applications of this storytelling were immediate and essential. In an era of often murky succession laws, disputes over inheritance were common. Was the eldest son always the rightful heir? What if a cousin had a claim through a distant but powerful branch of the family? The oral genealogy, preserved in story form, was the primary tool for resolving these conflicts. An elder or a respected skald could be called upon to recite the relevant lineage. The rhythmic, formulaic nature of these recitations was key. The predictable patterns and repetitive structures acted as a mnemonic check, making it incredibly difficult to insert a fraudulent name or skip a generation without the error being obvious to those who had heard the official version before. The story itself provided the context. It wasn't just a name, but the story of what that person did, who they married, and what land they held. This narrative evidence was often considered more reliable than any written document, which could be forged or lost because it lived in the collective memory of the community, validated by consistent retelling. This practice of oral documentation turned each family's history into a living, breathing entity, a shared asset that every member carried within them. It ensured that knowledge of one's lineage, and thus one's place in the world, was not confined to a scroll in a monastery but was shouted from the rafters of great halls and whispered around cooking fires. It was a system that fostered a deep and unshakable social identity, connecting the individual to a grand narrative that stretched back through time. This meticulous, story-driven preservation of genealogy was the glue that held the kinship-based structure of medieval society together, proving that who you were was ultimately a story about where you came from. While the sagas of warriors and the laws of the Thing field were powerful, another profound force was weaving its own memory code into the fabric of medieval life, one that reached into the deepest questions of human existence. The Church, with its vast network of monasteries and parishes, became a master architect of narrative, using the compelling stories of saints, martyrs, and biblical figures to encode a comprehensive moral and legal framework for society. This wasn't just about saving souls, it was about creating a shared language of right and wrong that could guide behavior in a world often teetering on the brink of chaos. Religious narratives provided a divine anchor for the medieval memory code, offering ultimate consequences and eternal rewards that made the lessons within them impossible to ignore. Think of the average medieval peasant toiling in the fields, their world limited to the village and its surrounding woods. Concepts like justice, mercy, or divine will were immense and abstract. The Church made these ideas shockingly tangible through story. The tale of St. George wasn't merely a fantasy about a knight and a dragon. It was a potent allegory for the constant struggle between good and evil, a battle that played out in every human heart and in the community itself. George's victory symbolized the protection that faith and virtue offered against the destructive forces of sin and chaos. Similarly, the parables of Jesus were not simple lessons but intricate memory devices. The story of the Good Samaritan, for instance, did far more than encourage kindness. It laid out a specific, legally actionable principle of neighborly obligation that transcended tribal or ethnic hatreds, effectively encoding a law of universal charity into an unforgettable mini-drama. The delivery of these stories was a spectacle designed for maximum impact. They weren't confined to a mumbled Latin mass that few understood. They were performed with breathtaking theatricality during religious festivals and feast days. A parish priest, perhaps wearing a simple mask, would act out the confrontation between David and Goliath on the church steps. During the Easter season, entire communities would participate in passion plays, vividly reenacting the crucifixion and resurrection. These were not passive viewing experiences. They were communal events that engaged all the senses: the smell of incense, the sound of chanting, the sight of a fellow villager portraying a tormented saint. This multi-sensory immersion transformed abstract theological concepts into visceral, emotional realities. The lesson about the sin of greed wasn't a lecture. It was the terrifying story of Judas's betrayal, performed in front of you, making the consequence of that sin feel immediate and real. This narrative strategy also had direct and practical implications for daily life and local law. Sermons often wove these religious stories together with secular concerns. A parable about the wise and foolish builders could be seamlessly connected to the importance of maintaining sturdy, safe homes for the community, reinforcing local building codes. The story of the feeding of the 5,000, which emphasized sharing limited resources, could be used to underscore the legal and moral obligation of landowners to provide charity in times of famine, a concept known as the moral economy. This created a powerful feedback loop where divine law informed human law, and human experience was interpreted through a divine lens. A land dispute might be settled not only by reciting a saga about a boundary stone, but also by referencing the biblical injunction against moving a neighbor's landmark. This blending of the spiritual and the secular created a remarkably cohesive worldview for medieval people. There was no neat division between the laws of God and the laws of man. They were intertwined in a single, story-driven system of meaning. The enduring power of these religious narratives lies in their ability to operate on two levels simultaneously. They provided a grand, cosmic map of salvation while also offering practical, everyday guidance on how to live, work, and resolve conflicts with your neighbors. They shaped belief by making the divine relatable, and they shaped action by providing a narrative blueprint for a virtuous life. This fusion ensured that the Church's teachings were not just believed, but lived, remembered, and enforced, making religious storytelling one of the most enduring and influential applications of the medieval memory code. Yet this monumental shift from memory to manuscript was far from an overnight revolution. The world of oral storytelling did not simply vanish with the scratch of a quill. Instead, it evolved, merging with the new written word to create a fascinating hybrid system of record-keeping. For generations, the spoken story had been the ultimate authority, the living, breathing archive of a community. A written document in its early days was often viewed with a degree of suspicion, a static, silent thing that could be forged, lost, or misinterpreted by those who did not understand its full context. Its power, therefore, had to be borrowed from the old, trusted ways. This is why the earliest scribes were less like modern bureaucrats and more like translators, carefully encoding the familiar rhythms and devices of oral tradition directly onto the parchment. We can see this beautiful fusion at work in one of the most famous administrative documents in history, the Domesday Book. commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086. This vast survey of England's land and resources was a breathtaking feat of written organization. But look closer at its entries, and you'll find the ghost of the storyteller lingering in the margins. A dry entry listing a manor's value might be followed by a brief but crucial narrative note, an explanation that a certain piece of land had been held by a particular family since the time of King Cnut, having been granted for loyal service in a long-ago sea battle. This wasn't just trivia, it was the legal story. It provided the narrative context that gave the cold numbers their meaning and legitimacy, transforming a simple inventory into a record of loyalty, service, and inherited right the very heart of the feudal contract, preserved in the old way, even within the new. The performance of law also stubbornly retained its oral character. The Magna Carta, sealed in 1215, is arguably the most important written legal document in English history. Yet its power was not initially in its silent reading by a few learned barons. Its authority was unleashed when it was proclaimed aloud by town criers in market squares and read out before gatherings of knights and freemen. The act of public recitation was everything. It was a performative event that harkened back to the old moots where law was spoken into being, making it a collective experience that bound the community to its terms. The spoken word gave the written text its life and its force, ensuring it was heard, understood, and remembered by all, not just seen by a privileged few. This ritual of reading aloud became a standard practice for statutes and proclamations for centuries, a testament to the enduring belief that for a law to be truly legitimate, it had to be a story told to the people. This period of hybridization reveals a society caught between two worlds, expertly using the tools of both. A written charter might grant a tract of land, but its legitimacy was often confirmed by having it witnessed by a large group of people who would then remember the event and its terms, becoming living repositories of the agreement. A court case might be recorded in a written roll, but the arguments presented would lean heavily on oral precedents, the retelling of a similar case from the past, a story everyone knew. The written word provided permanence and a check against the slow drift of memory, while the spoken story provided the indispensable context, the emotional resonance, and the communal buy-in. They were not rivals, they were partners, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. This gradual, centuries-long transition teaches us a profound lesson about the resilience of human tradition. The adoption of a new, more efficient technology does not automatically erase the old ways that are deeply woven into the culture's identity. The medieval memory code, built on the power of narrative, was so effective and so deeply ingrained that it refused to die. Instead, it infused the new written records with its own spirit, ensuring that even as society began to lean on parchment, the heart of the law, the soul of the land, and the bonds of loyalty continued to beat to the rhythm of a well-told story. This stubborn persistence underscores just how fundamental storytelling had been, and continues to be, to the human experience. Nowhere is the astonishing power of this medieval memory code more vividly preserved than in the cold, clear air of Iceland, within the pages of the Icelandic Sagas. These are not the fantastical myths of gods and monsters that characterize so much of medieval literature. The family sagas, or Icelandinga are something entirely unique, gritty, realistic prose narratives that read like historical novels, meticulously documenting the lives, disputes, and destinies of the first generations of Norse settlers. They are our most brilliant window into how a functioning society could be built, maintained, and remembered entirely through the power of story. Iceland in the Saga Age was a land without a king, without a standing army, and without an executive authority to enforce its laws. Its governance rested entirely on a complex web of custom, reciprocal obligation, and the collective memory of the people. The sagas were the vital thread that held this entire delicate web together. Consider the sprawling, tragic masterpiece that is Njál's Saga. On its surface, it is a gripping tale of friendship, honor, and an inexorable blood feud that consumes countless lives. But to its original audience, it was also a detailed legal textbook. The saga is saturated with law. It documents, step by step, the proper procedures for summoning an opponent to the All-Thing, the National Assembly. It illustrates the exact number of witnesses required to validate a claim, the formal language needed to issue a challenge, and the intricate rules of compensation for every conceivable injury. When a character is wronged, the saga doesn't just show his anger. It shows him and his allies engaging in a meticulous legal strategy, plotting how to bring their case before the law rock in the most compelling way possible. The dramatic climaxes often occur not on the battlefield, but during the legal debates at the assembly, where the fate of characters hinges on a point of procedure or the testimony of a key witness. The story itself was a precedent, a dramatic rehearsal of legal principles that every free man needed to know. The sagas also functioned as the island's immutable land registry. In a world of volatile glaciers and shifting coastlines, human memory was the most reliable map. The sagas are filled with astonishingly precise descriptions of property that would put a modern surveyor to shame. A narrative might pause its action to detail a land purchase. Hoskuld bought the land west of the river Markarfljot from the gully that runs down from the mountain all the way to the sea, but with shared rights to the driftwood on the eastern bank. This wasn't lyrical scene setting. It was a legally binding description embedded in a story that would be told and retold, ensuring that the knowledge of that boundary outlived any wooden post or stone cairn that could be moved or destroyed. To dispute a land claim, you didn't produce a parchment deed. You or your skald had to recite a more accurate, more detailed, and more widely accepted version of the story that contained its description. At the heart of these narratives were characters who became archetypes of Viking Age values, their fates serving as powerful moral lessons for the community. Take the heroic figure of Gunnar Hamundasson from Njál's Saga. He is the ideal Viking warrior, brave, generous, and steadfastly loyal to his friends, yet his story is a classic tragedy. After being sentenced to exile for killing, he prepares to leave Iceland. As he rides away, his horse stumbles. He looks back at his farm, Eichlidarendi, and sees the beauty of the hillside in spring, the fields green and inviting. Overcome with love for his homeland, he declares, "So lovely is the hillside that I have never seen it so beautiful before, with the ripe corn and the mown hay, and I will ride back home and not go away." This fatal decision, this ultimate expression of loyalty to his land over his own safety, leads directly to his death. His story was a poignant, unforgettable lesson in the complex interplay between honor, loyalty, and the harsh consequences of one's choices. It taught that even the greatest hero could be brought down by a single, emotionally charged decision. A lesson that resonated deeply in a culture where emotional control and pragmatism were essential for survival. The credibility of the sagas was their greatest strength, their realistic style, their grounding in real geography, and their focus on the cause and effect of human action made them trusted sources. When a saga mentioned a landmark, it was a real place the audience could visit. When it described a feud, it followed a logical progression that mirrored their own experiences with conflict. This realism transformed the sagas from mere entertainment into a trusted communal archive. They were considered a reliable record of what had truly happened, which gave the legal and social principles they contained an authority that a dry list of rules could never achieve. For centuries, this narrative legal system allowed a remote island of farmers and seafarers to govern themselves with remarkable stability. The Sagas stand as a monumental testament to the idea that a society can be held together not by force, but by the shared power of a story well told. Across the sea in Ireland, a strikingly parallel system was thriving, one where the poets held the keys to the law itself. Here, the ancient Brehon laws, a complex and sophisticated legal code that governed every aspect of life from beekeeping to kingship, were not carved on stone or written in books for centuries. Instead, they were held in the minds and spoken through the voices of a special class of learned poets known as the Fili. These men were the ultimate synthesis of artist, scholar, and jurist, undergoing rigorous training that could last up to 12 years to master the immense body of legal knowledge. Their tool was poetry, and their method was the story. They didn't just recite dry legal statutes, they transformed the law into a living, breathing narrative art form, using the powerful engines of allegory and metaphor to make the most complex principles not only understandable but truly unforgettable. Consider the challenge of explaining a nuanced concept like surety, the law surrounding a person who acts as a guarantor for a contract or a debt. A modern legal textbook might offer a dense paragraph of definitions and clauses. A Brehon Fili, however, would summon the story of a mythical judge like Fithel. He might tell a tale of a chieftain who stood surety for a friend's loan of cattle, weaving a narrative where the friend defaults. The cattle are lost in a raid, and the chieftain is faced with the moral and legal dilemma of fulfilling his obligation. The story would explore the tension between friendship and duty, the financial ruin that could follow a poor decision, and the ultimate judgment delivered by Fithel that restores balance. This narrative did more than define a term. It illustrated the immense weight of being a surety, the potential consequences for all parties, and the societal expectation of honoring one's word. It packaged the entire legal and ethical dimension of the concept into a human drama that anyone, from a farmer to a king, could immediately grasp and internalize. The performance of these legal stories was a central part of communal life. At great festivals like the Onak, which functioned as massive social, commercial, and political gatherings, the Fili would take on a role similar to a modern-day judge delivering a landmark ruling to a packed courtroom. Their recitations were public service announcements, legal precedents, and captivating entertainment all rolled into one. As the poet's voice rose and fell in the rhythmic cadences of his crafted verse, the audience wasn't just passively listening, they were actively participating in the reinforcement of their own legal order. By hearing the story of a past judgment, they were learning how to adjudicate their own future disputes. This system ensured that the law was not a secret knowledge guarded by an elite few, but a common possession of the entire community, a shared language of justice that everyone spoke and understood. A key strength of this story-based system was its remarkable flexibility and adaptability. A written law is fixed, and changing it can be a slow, cumbersome process. But a story is a living, malleable thing. A skilled Fili could take a classic tale about, say, the proper compensation for a trespassing pig, and adapt it to a new situation involving a new type of property or a novel social conflict. He could adjust the characters, the setting, or the specific details while keeping the core legal principle, the concept of restitution for damages, utterly intact. This allowed the Brehon law to evolve organically alongside the society it served, responding to new technologies, changing economic conditions, and shifting social mores without ever losing its essential connection to the wisdom of the past. The story was the vessel, and while the specific contents might shift slightly from telling to telling, the vessel itself remained strong, reliably carrying the law forward through time. This profound integration of narrative and law did more than just preserve rules. It forged a powerful and unbreakable connection between legal identity and community identity. To be part of an Irish tuath or tribe was to know and share in its stories. The laws weren't arbitrary rules imposed from above. They were the distilled wisdom of the ancestors, the collected judgments of legendary figures like Fithel, and the shared experiences of the people themselves, all encoded in a rich tapestry of tale and verse. This created a deep sense of ownership and respect for the legal tradition. It was their law born from their stories, and it defined who they were as a people. Even when external pressures, from Norman invasions to English colonial rule, sought to suppress the Brehon laws, the tradition proved incredibly resilient. The stories continued to be told in homes and fields, preserving the memory of the law in the hearts of the people long after the schools of the Fili had closed, a testament to the enduring power of a legal system written not on parchment but on the human soul. But the power of this narrative tradition wasn't confined to the halls of power or the resolution of disputes. It also formed the very bedrock of learning, shaping young minds within the walls of monasteries and the earliest schools. Medieval education was a deeply immersive experience, and its primary vehicle was the story. Educators of the time possessed a profound, almost intuitive understanding of a principle that modern science would later confirm. Information wrapped in narrative is not only more engaging, but is also far more likely to be retained. For a young novice monk or a nobleman's son, lessons in grammar, rhetoric, and even law were not dry drills from a textbook. They were dynamic adventures, moral quandaries, and epic histories, all designed to implant knowledge directly into the memory through the power of a well-told tale. Consider the humble fable, a tool as practical as it was philosophical. Aesop's stories, circulating widely in medieval Europe, were not mere children's entertainment. In a classroom, the tale of the tortoise and the hare became a masterclass in logical reasoning and cause and effect. A teacher wouldn't just state the moral, slow and steady wins the race. He would guide his students through the narrative itself, having them analyze the hare's arrogant choices and the tortoise's unwavering focus. This prompted students to engage in basic logic. If one is overconfident and negligent, then one will fail, even with superior natural gifts. Similarly, parables from the Bible, like the story of the prodigal son, served as complex case studies in ethics, forgiveness, and social responsibility, teaching students to deconstruct human motivation and consequence. These stories were the original critical thinking exercises, training young minds to reason and deduce within a framework that was both memorable and deeply enjoyable. The curriculum extended far beyond moral philosophy. Historical chronicles were the primary textbooks for subjects like history and geography. A student wouldn't memorize a list of dates and dead kings. They would listen to the gripping saga of a king's reign, his battles, his alliances, his triumphs, and his failures. The geography of Europe was learned not from a map, but by following the route of Charlemagne's campaigns or the pilgrimage of a saint to Rome. By embedding facts within a narrative sequence, the information became a journey. The names of cities, rivers, and mountains were no longer abstract points. They were the backdrops to great events, the places where a hero fell or a miracle occurred. This narrative context provided a rich mental scaffolding upon which a vast array of factual knowledge could be securely hung. To further cement this knowledge, educators employed clever mnemonic devices directly within their stories. Acrostics, where the first letter of each line spells out a word or phrase, were a popular tool. A long, complex prayer or a list of theological virtues could be turned into a simple poem, its structure providing a built-in retrieval system for the memory. Rhymes and rhythmic chants were used for everything from Latin verb conjugations to the steps of a mathematical process. The rhythmic, sing-song nature of these recitations tapped into the same cognitive pathways as music and poetry, making dry, repetitive information stick. A student might chant the laws of inheritance in a specific meter, the rhythm itself acting as a guide to ensure not a single clause was forgotten. This wasn't rote memorization for its own sake. It was the strategic use of narrative's natural strengths to ensure the accurate and long-term preservation of essential knowledge. This story-driven approach was the great equalizer in a world of limited literacy. It allowed knowledge to flow seamlessly across social strata. A learned cleric, a knight, and a skilled craftsperson might all share the same foundational understanding of history, law, and morality because they had all been taught through the same core set of stories. This shared narrative lexicon created a common cultural language, a unified frame of reference that bound society together. The practice of using narrative as a primary pedagogical tool demonstrates that medieval educators were, in many ways, ahead of their time. They understood that for knowledge to truly take root, it must connect with the human experience on an emotional and imaginative level. This ancient recognition that we are, fundamentally, storytelling creatures who learn best through narrative is a legacy that continues to shape the most effective teaching methods in our own classrooms today. Beyond the practicalities of law and land, the stories told in firelit halls and village squares served a purpose even more profound. They were the invisible threads weaving individuals into a cohesive community, stitching together a shared identity from the tapestry of collective memory. In a world of localized loyalties and constant uncertainty, this sense of belonging was not a luxury, it was a vital tool for survival. The repeated recitation of a people's origin myth, the triumphant saga of a founding hero, or the somber tale of a great famine endured by their ancestors, these narratives did more than inform. They answered the most fundamental human questions: who are we? Where did we come from? What do we believe in? By providing common answers, storytelling forged a powerful group consciousness, transforming a scattered population into a unified people with a shared destiny. This process of building cohesion was intensely communal and performative. The great feasts, seasonal festivals, and wedding celebrations that punctuated the medieval year were far more than just occasions for merriment. They were the crucial stages upon which this shared identity was ritually performed and reaffirmed. When a skilled bard recited the origin story of a tribe, perhaps how their people were led to this land by a wise she-wolf or granted favor by a thunder god, he wasn't just telling a story everyone had heard before. He was reenacting the birth of the community itself. With each retelling, the listeners weren't passive audience members. They were participants in a ritual that bound them to each other and to the generations that had come before. The familiar rhythm of the words, the collective intake of breath at a key moment, the shared laughter or sorrow. These experiences created a powerful emotional synchrony, a feeling of being part of something much larger than oneself. The Arthurian legends provide a stunning example of how a narrative framework could transcend local boundaries to create a shared cultural ideal across vast and diverse regions. In the fractious world of medieval Europe, with its countless petty kingdoms and rival lords, the tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table offered a unifying vision of chivalry, justice, and fellowship that resonated from the courts of France to the castles of Germany. A knight in Aquitaine and a knight in Saxony might owe allegiance to different feudal masters and speak different dialects, but they could both aspire to the courage of Lancelot, the wisdom of Gawain, or the purity of Galahad. These stories created a pan-European code of conduct, a shared language of honor that allowed nobles from different lands to recognize a common brotherhood. The Round Table itself became a potent symbol of equality and shared purpose, an ideal that could be referenced to mediate disputes and encourage alliances between otherwise competing powers. This collective memory, diligently maintained by storytelling, acted as a society's most effective conflict resolution mechanism. In the absence of strong central authorities, disputes were inevitable. But a community with a deep well of shared stories had a ready reference point for mediation. An elder mediating a quarrel between two families could invoke a tale from the past where a similar dispute was resolved through compromise and wisdom, reminding everyone of the consequences of letting conflict escalate. The stories provided a precedent for forgiveness, a model for restitution, and a powerful warning against the cycles of violence that could destroy a community from within. They affirmed the mutual obligations that everyone owed each other, the duty of the strong to protect the weak, the obligation of the rich to be generous to the poor, framing these not as arbitrary rules, but as timeless principles embedded in the very history of the people. Ultimately, the true genius of this system lay in its ability to operate on the human heart. Dry laws and proclaimed decrees could command obedience, but they could not command loyalty. Stories could, by engaging emotions, inspiring pride with tales of heroism, fostering empathy with stories of loss, and kindling a sense of awe with myths of divine favor. These narratives forged bonds of trust and affection that were far stronger than any fear of punishment. The social fabric they wove was resilient because it was made of shared emotion and common belief, a collective understanding of the world that told every individual unequivocally that they belonged. This was the highest function of the medieval memory code, not merely to store information, but to build and maintain the very community that gave that information its meaning and its life. While the great halls echoed with the sagas of kings and the deeds of warriors, another, quieter but equally vital stream of narrative was flowing in the home, the garden, and the cloister, carried forward by women. Their role as storytellers and keepers of memory has often been overshadowed by the more public performances of bards and skalds, yet their contributions were foundational, weaving the essential, everyday threads of knowledge that held the fabric of daily life together. In the domestic sphere, away from the formal assemblies and royal courts, women served as the primary archivists of the intimate and the practical, the keepers of the stories that defined family identity and ensured communal survival. A grandmother by the hearth, spinning wool while recounting the tale of how her own grandmother saved the village from a plague with a specific combination of herbs, was doing far more than passing the time. She was transmitting a living database of practical medicine, embedding the knowledge of which plants to harvest, how to prepare them, and when to administer them within a memorable narrative framework. This was the memory code in its most immediate and personal form, where a story could literally mean the difference between life and death. Their repertoire was vast and deeply integrated into the rhythm of daily life. The lullaby sung to soothe a restless child often contained fragments of older, protective charms or gentle warnings about the world. The stories told while preparing food preserved knowledge of which wild plants were safe to eat, how to preserve meats for the winter, and the traditional rituals for blessing a harvest. In teaching a daughter the intricate steps of weaving or embroidery, a mother would often pair the technical instruction with the stories behind the patterns. Perhaps this knot design was first used by an ancestor to signify their loyalty to a particular lord, or that floral motif was meant to honor the spirit of the forest that provided the dyes. This seamless blend of the practical and the symbolic ensured that crucial skills were never just a set of instructions. They were a part of the family's story, imbued with meaning and history that made them far more engaging and memorable for the next generation. In the courts of the nobility, women exerted their influence on the narrative landscape in a different, yet equally powerful way. A figure like Elena of Aquitaine was not merely a passive listener to the troubadours who flocked to her court. She was a discerning patron and a cultural architect. By championing the poets who sang the new songs of Finema or courtly love, she and other noblewomen helped to fundamentally shift the European cultural conversation. These narratives, which placed women on a pedestal as objects of devotion and sources of inspiration, may seem romanticized to us now, but they introduced a revolutionary new code of conduct. They encoded complex social etiquette, defining the manners, speech, and behaviors expected of a refined courtier. The stories of unrequited love and noble sacrifice served as a counterpoint to the brutish warrior ethos, creating a new narrative framework for loyalty, not just to a lord, but to a chosen lady and to the ideals of grace and chivalry itself. This was storytelling as soft power, where women shaped the very values that would govern aristocratic society for centuries. Beyond the secular world, women also mastered the art of visionary narrative to convey profound theological and scientific knowledge. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, and polymath, stands as a towering example. Her prolific writings on medicine, natural science, and theology were not presented as dry academic texts. They were framed within powerful, divinely inspired visions, complex, allegorical stories filled with striking imagery like the cosmic egg or the human body as a microcosm of the universe. By embedding her vast knowledge within these visionary narratives, she made it accessible and compelling to a wide audience. A description of a plant's healing properties became part of a grander story about God's creation and the intricate balance of the natural world. This method allowed her to circulate ideas that might otherwise have been dismissed coming from a woman, using the authoritative and respected framework of a divine vision to preserve and share her insights, thus enriching the medieval understanding of the world through a uniquely female narrative lens. The collective impact of these female storytellers was to democratize and diversify the medieval memory code. While the male-dominated sagas often focused on war, law, and political power, the stories preserved by women frequently centered on healing, community, kinship, and the cycles of nature. They ensured that the collective memory was not a monolithic record of powerful men, but a rich, multifaceted tapestry that included the wisdom of the hearth, the secrets of the garden, and the mystic visions of the cloister. This inclusivity made the overall cultural knowledge more resilient and far more complete. Recognizing their indispensable role adds crucial depth and color to our understanding of this era, revealing that the preservation of law, land, and loyalty was supported by a much broader and more nuanced narrative network than we often assume, one where the voices of women provided the essential hum of daily life that made the grand choruses of history possible. Imagine a heated argument brewing between two neighboring farmers over a trampled barley field. Accusations fly, tempers flare, and the potential for a violent feud simmers just beneath the surface. In our modern world, we might call a lawyer or summon the police, but in a medieval village, the first tool for peace was often not a warrant, but a well-chosen story. The community elder, a respected figure steeped in local law, wouldn't begin by quoting a rule. Instead, he might calm the crowd and say, "This brings to mind the time, years ago, when old Einar's sheep got into Thorstein's garden." He would then recount the entire tale, the damage done, the initial anger, the wise intervention of a third party, and the solution they crafted, perhaps having Einar help Thorstein repair the fence and forfeit a portion of his next wool clip. This narrative wasn't a diversion, it was the very process of justice in action. By framing the current dispute within a familiar story from the shared past, the elder was doing something profound. He was depersonalizing the conflict, removing the immediate sting of blame, and offering a pre-approved, culturally sanctioned pathway to resolution that everyone already understood and accepted. The story became a neutral ground, a common reference point that belonged to the whole community, not just to the aggrieved parties. This practice was formalized in governing assemblies across Germanic and Norse cultures, known as things. At these gatherings, which were part court, part parliament, and part community meeting, the law speaker or presiding judge held immense authority. But his power wasn't rooted in armed force. It was rooted in his command of narrative precedent. When a complex case involving a blood feud or a contested inheritance came before the thing, the judge wouldn't simply consult a written code. He would reach into the vast repository of oral history and recite the outcome of a similar case from decades or even generations past. These stories served as the binding legal precedents for a society that trusted lived experience over abstract legislation. The recitation was a performance of memory and wisdom, and its goal was rarely pure punishment. The narratives overwhelmingly emphasized themes of restoration and reconciliation. A story might use the powerful metaphor of a broken arm that must be set and healed, rather than a debt that must be punished, framing justice as a process of mending the social fabric that had been torn by the dispute. This focus on healing and balance ensured that the goal was to restore harmony to the community, not just to inflict pain on an offender, preventing minor conflicts from spiraling into generations of vengeful violence. The effectiveness of this method lay in its brilliant psychological insight. A direct command or an imposed verdict can feel arbitrary and often breeds resentment. But a story works on a different level entirely. It allows the conflicting parties to see their situation from a new, third-person perspective. Listening to a tale about two other farmers in a similar argument, the current combatants are subtly invited to empathize, to recognize their own folly in the actions of the characters, and to project themselves into the peaceful resolution offered at the tale's end. It creates a cognitive shift, helping them move beyond the narrow confines of their immediate grievance and see the larger context of social harmony and mutual dependence that their conflict threatens. This narrative approach transformed the resolution process from a win-lose confrontation into a collaborative search for a solution that echoed the wisdom of the ancestors. It fostered a culture where dialogue, guided by shared stories, was the default method for restoring balance, proving that the most powerful tool for peace was often not a weapon, but a parable. This remarkable flexibility was the lifeblood of the medieval memory code, ensuring it never became a brittle relic of the past. The stories that held society together were not locked in amber. They were living, breathing entities that evolved in lockstep with the communities that told them. Think of them not as ancient, unchanging monuments, but as rivers constantly flowing, shifting their course to navigate new terrain, absorbing new streams of influence, yet always maintaining their essential purpose. A saga that began as a pagan tale of a land spirit might, over generations, be gently reshaped into a story about a Christian saint who tamed the wilderness, all while preserving the original, underlying message about the sacredness and proper stewardship of that particular place. The characters and divine agents might change with the prevailing faith, but the core legal principle embedded within the narrative, the description of the land's boundary, the rights to its resources remained perfectly intact, its authority undiminished. This process of narrative adaptation was a masterclass in cultural negotiation, especially during periods of immense social upheaval like the Christianization of Europe. Missionaries and clever rulers quickly realized that it was far more effective to build upon existing stories than to try and erase them outright. A vibrant local legend about a powerful goddess associated with a healing spring could be seamlessly repurposed. The goddess might be recast as a saint, perhaps Saint Bridget in Ireland, who performed miracles at that very same spring, thereby transferring the site's spiritual significance and the traditional practices surrounding it into the new religious framework. This wasn't a cynical erasure, it was a brilliant act of preservation. The community didn't lose its connection to a sacred site or the customary laws that governed it. Instead, they gained a new layer of meaning that allowed their traditions to continue under a new orthodox banner. The story evolved to ensure the knowledge within it survived, demonstrating a pragmatic and deeply respectful understanding of how memory truly works. The same adaptive principle applied to the most practical aspects of daily life. As feudal systems solidified and new forms of land tenure emerged, the stories had to keep pace. A narrative that once detailed a simple gift of land from a chieftain to a loyal warrior might be expanded in later tellings to include the new, more complex obligations of knight service, the specific number of armed men the warrior's descendant now owed to the king for 40 days a year. The story would grow to encompass these new legal realities, encoding them in a memorable narrative form just as it had the original grant. During times of migration or invasion, as populations moved and borders shifted, stories of origin were deftly updated. A clan's founding myth might be retooled to explain their presence in a new land, perhaps by adding an episode where their ancestral hero was granted this new territory by a conquering king, thereby legitimizing their claim and integrating their history into the larger narrative of the new ruling power. This ensured that a people's sense of identity and their legal rights remained coherent and defensible, even as their physical world changed around them. This evolutionary quality is what made the oral tradition so extraordinarily resilient. A written law, once inscribed, is fixed. If circumstances change, the document becomes obsolete, and the cumbersome process of creating a new one must begin. But an oral story is inherently fluid. A skilled storyteller, attuned to the needs of his audience, could subtly emphasize certain aspects, downplay others, or introduce a new character or event that reflected contemporary realities, all while maintaining the structural integrity of the tale. The story could be tailored to the specific audience and the immediate context, making its lessons more immediately relevant and persuasive. This dynamism meant that the collective wisdom of a culture was in a constant state of gentle renewal, always relevant, always applicable. It was a system designed for permanence not through rigidity, but through its graceful, intelligent ability to bend without breaking, to incorporate the new without discarding the old, proving that the strongest memory is one that knows how to grow. Yet for all its power and resilience, this intricate world of spoken memory could not withstand the relentless tide of a new technology, the printing press. The arrival of movable type in the 15th century didn't just change how information was shared. It fundamentally rewired society's very concept of authority and truth. Where once the resonant, performative voice of the elder, the bard, or the law speaker held ultimate sway, now the silent, fixed, and reproducible text began to claim dominion. This was the beginning of a great and gradual silencing, a shift from the communal ear to the private eye, where the warmth of a shared story around a fire began to cool into the solitary act of reading by a lamp. The authority of knowledge was slowly transferred from the person who could remember and recite to the person who could own and display the book. Written records, charters, legal codes, printed proclamations possessed a new kind of permanence and could be circulated far beyond the sound of any human voice, creating a powerful, centralized standard that often dismissed local oral traditions as mere hearsay or superstition. This monumental transition, however, was not a swift and total conquest. The decline of the oral tradition was a slow, uneven erosion, not a sudden collapse. In the bustling courts of kings and the studies of rising merchant classes, literacy spread quickly, and the written word became the new currency of power and commerce. But in the vast countryside, in remote villages nestled in mountains or separated by deep forests, the old ways clung stubbornly to life. For generations, oral storytelling persisted as the primary means of preserving family history, local customs, and community law. Marginalized groups, often denied access to formal education and literacy, became the unexpected guardians of this fading art. The stories of the poor, the indigenous, and the geographically isolated became living museums of the medieval memory code, preserving in their songs, folktales, and seasonal rituals a wealth of knowledge that the official written record had simply overlooked or chosen to ignore. With this shift, something profound and subtle was lost: the rich, emotional context that lived within the performance of a story. A written legal decree could state a boundary line with clinical precision, but it could not capture the tremor in the elder's voice as he described the ancient oak that marked that boundary, nor could it convey the collective nod of recognition from the villagers who had played in its shade as children. The written record often flattened the multi-dimensional world of oral narrative into two dimensions, stripping away the local nuances, the emotional weight, and the adaptable spirit that had given the old stories their enduring power and relevance. A property dispute might now be settled by a dusty parchment, but the deeper understanding of why that boundary mattered, the story of the feud it had once settled, and the shared memory of the community that had witnessed the original agreement, all of that vital context slowly faded from view, disconnecting people from the deeper layers of their own collective memory. This erosion had a direct and damaging impact on the very glue that held communities together, social cohesion. When a society no longer gathers regularly to hear its foundational stories recited aloud, it begins to lose its shared narrative. The rituals that once reinforced identity, the annual beating of the bounds, the recitation of genealogies at a feast, the performance of a saga at the winter solstice diminished in importance. Without these shared narrative experiences, the sense of being part of a continuous story that stretched backward and forward through time began to weaken. Individuals and nuclear families became more focused on their own documented lineages and written contracts, rather than on their place within the larger, interdependent community. The collective memory, once a vibrant, shared tapestry, risked fraying into a collection of individual, private threads, and yet the spirit of the medieval memory code refused to die. It did not vanish, but instead retreated, finding refuge in new forms. It survived in the folklore collected by antiquarians, in the fairy tales told to children, and in the plots of plays and novels where themes of loyalty, justice, and inherited guilt echoed the old sagas. Legal customs, even when written down, often retained the ghost of their oral origins. The concept of common law itself is built upon precedent and custom, a kind of written echo of storytelling. Recognizing this long, uneven decline is crucial because it forces us to see that the shift from oral to written culture was not a simple story of progress. It was a trade-off. We gained standardization, wide dissemination, and a powerful new tool for preserving information. But we also lost a deeply human, emotionally resonant, and community-centered system of knowledge that connected people to their past, to their place, and to each other in ways that a filing cabinet simply never could. It turns out we never truly abandoned the memory code of our medieval ancestors. We simply gave it new tools and new names. The same principles that preserved law and land for centuries are now experiencing a spectacular revival, proving that the human brain's operating system hasn't changed as much as we might think. In the most demanding cognitive arenas of the modern world, these ancient techniques are not just being studied, they are dominating. The world of competitive memory sports, for instance, is a dazzling display of the method of loci in action. So-called memory athletes, who can memorize the order of a shuffled deck of cards in under a minute or recall hundreds of names and faces, aren't blessed with superhuman brains. They are master architects of mental palaces, just like a medieval skald preparing to recite a saga. They visually place each card or each name in a specific location along a familiar mental journey, transforming abstract data into a vivid narrative walkthrough. Their incredible feats are a powerful laboratory demonstration of what medieval societies knew instinctively: that information woven into a spatial and narrative tapestry is information that endures. This understanding is now flooding into the field of education, revolutionizing how we teach and learn. Modern cognitive psychology has confirmed what medieval bards took for granted: stories are the brain's preferred file format. Educators are increasingly moving away from rote memorization of disjointed facts and toward a curriculum built around narrative structures. Complex scientific processes, like cellular mitosis or the water cycle, are taught not as a list of steps but as a character-driven story with a beginning, middle, and end. Historical events are framed as gripping narratives with causes, conflicts, and consequences, making them far more engaging and memorable than any timeline. This isn't just a fad, it's a return to the most fundamental and effective way humans have always transmitted knowledge. By embedding lessons within a story, we are not dumbing down the material. We are tapping into a deep, evolutionary pathway for learning that ensures the information is not only understood but retained for a lifetime. The legal profession, the direct descendant of the medieval thing assembly, is also rediscovering its narrative roots. While modern law is buried in written statutes and dense legal opinions, the most effective lawyers and law professors are, at their core, master storytellers. The Socratic method used in law schools is a direct echo of the interactive dialogue between a skald and his audience, pushing students to think on their feet and argue precedent. More importantly, the entire concept of case law is built upon storytelling. A lawyer arguing before a jury isn't just presenting evidence, they are crafting a compelling narrative, a story of what happened, who is responsible, and why justice demands a certain outcome. They are building a mental palace for the jury, placing each piece of evidence in a room, guiding them through a logical and emotionally resonant path to a verdict. This modern legal practice is a direct continuation of the medieval tradition where the most persuasive and memorable narrative, the one that best aligned with the community's sense of justice, would carry the day. Beyond courtrooms and classrooms, the digital age has unleashed a new golden age of oral storytelling, one that would astonish our medieval predecessors. Podcasts have become the new great halls, where millions gather to listen to deep-dive narratives on everything from true crime to history to science. These long-form audio experiences tap into the same primal need for spoken narrative, building communities of listeners who share a common story. Simultaneously, digital archives and oral history projects are using modern technology to preserve the very traditions that technology once threatened. Organizations now record the stories of elders, veterans, and immigrants, ensuring that first-person accounts and local histories are saved in perpetuity, creating a digital memory palace for entire cultures. This movement honors the spirit of the medieval memory code by recognizing that the most valuable history often lies not in official documents, but in the spoken stories of everyday people. Even the world of commerce has learned that facts tell, but stories sell. The most successful brands today are no longer just selling products. They are selling identities and values wrapped in a narrative. They craft origin stories about garage-based founders. They build mythologies around their commitment to sustainability, and they create emotional connections with customers by making them characters in an ongoing brand saga. This is the corporate equivalent of a chieftain patronizing a skald to sing of his generosity and bravery. It's a strategy to build fierce loyalty and a sense of shared purpose around a common story. This resurgence across so many facets of modern life, from sports to education to marketing, proves a simple, profound truth. The medieval memory code wasn't a primitive relic of a pre-literate world. It was a brilliant, evidence-based system for working with the grain of human cognition. Its triumphant return shows that in our frantic, information-saturated age, the need for a meaningful story to make sense of it all is more powerful than ever. Yet this incredible power to shape reality through narrative carries a profound and inescapable responsibility, forcing us to confront the ethical shadows that have always followed the storyteller. For every saga that preserved a just law, there could be another crafted to legitimize a tyrant's claim or erase the history of a rival clan. The medieval bard, after all, was rarely a free agent. He was often a retainer, his livelihood dependent on the patronage of a powerful lord or chieftain. This relationship created an inherent pressure to shape the narrative, to subtly exaggerate the patron's virtues, downplay their defeats, and perhaps cast a suspicious veil over the actions of their enemies. A skald might transform a military retreat into a strategic withdrawal, a contested inheritance into a divinely ordained succession, or a brutal act of suppression into a necessary act of justice. The same mnemonic techniques that ensured accuracy could also be weaponized to ensure a specific, manipulated version of events became the one cemented in public memory, influencing legal judgments and loyalties for generations based on a carefully curated and often unfair account. This historical reality holds up a disquieting mirror to our own information-saturated age, where the medieval marketplace of stories has been replaced by the digital town square. The core ethical challenges remain terrifyingly familiar, merely amplified by the speed and scale of modern technology. The deliberate spread of misinformation and propaganda today functions on the exact same principle as the biased saga of old. It wraps a desired conclusion inside a compelling, emotionally charged narrative designed to bypass critical thinking and embed itself directly into the audience's worldview. A modern political operative crafting a smear campaign and a medieval bard singing for his supper both understand that a simple, emotionally resonant story, repeated often enough, can become more powerful than a complex truth. The same cognitive pathways that once helped a community remember the boundaries of their common land can now be exploited to reinforce societal divisions and erode trust in shared institutions. Understanding the medieval memory code, therefore, provides us with a crucial defensive tool, a kind of mental armor for the 21st century. It teaches us to approach every story we hear, whether from a news outlet, a social media feed, or a political leader, not as a neutral recording of fact, but as a constructed narrative. It forces us to ask the same critical questions a discerning medieval listener might have silently considered: who is telling this story? What might they gain from my believing it? What perspectives or voices are being left out of this tale? This historical perspective empowers us to become more active and skeptical consumers of information, to look for the sources and intentions behind the narrative, and to recognize that every story is told from a particular point of view. This burden of ethics falls not just on the consumer, but perhaps even more heavily on the modern storyteller. Whether a journalist, a filmmaker, a podcaster, or a teacher, anyone who crafts a narrative for public consumption inherits the immense responsibility once shouldered by the Fili and the Scalds. Upholding integrity means a relentless commitment to accuracy and context, resisting the temptation to simplify a complex truth for the sake of a cleaner, more viral story. Championing inclusivity requires actively seeking out and amplifying marginalized voices and perspectives that have historically been excluded from the dominant narrative, ensuring that our collective story is not a monument to a single victor but a rich tapestry woven from countless threads. By examining the historical missteps, the time stories were used to oppress rather than empower, we gain a clearer vision for how to use this power for good. The medieval memory code shows us that stories are not merely entertainment, they are the fundamental architecture of human understanding. This deep reflection on their ethical use is not a tangent, but the very heart of the matter. It challenges us to wield this ancient tool with wisdom and conscience, to craft narratives that promote justice, foster genuine understanding, and ultimately build a world worthy of the stories we will tell about it tomorrow. While our journey has largely stayed within the castles and villages of medieval Europe, it's crucial to step back and see the breathtakingly wider picture. The use of storytelling as a sophisticated memory code is not a uniquely European invention. It is a brilliant and universal thread in the fabric of human civilization. From the very heart of Australia to the vast plains of North America, indigenous cultures have independently developed their own profound systems of oral knowledge preservation, systems that echo the methods of European bards and skalds with an uncanny resonance. This global perspective reveals something fundamental about our shared humanity, that in the absence of the written word, the human mind, no matter where it is on the planet, consistently turns to narrative, to rhythm, and to the land itself to build a durable bridge between the past and the present. Consider the Aboriginal concept of songlines, one of the most sophisticated memory systems ever devised. For the indigenous peoples of Australia, the entire continent is a living, breathing library. Songlines are intricate sequences of songs that narrate the journeys of ancestral creator beings during the dream time. Each song is a map describing the precise topography of the land. Every hill, every waterhole, every rock formation is a stanza in a vast musical epic. But these are not merely travel guides. They are also legal documents and deeds of ownership. The songs encode knowledge of where to find food and water. They dictate ceremonial responsibilities, and they establish the sacred boundaries between different clan groups. To know the song is to be able to navigate across thousands of miles of desert and to have the right to care for that country. This fusion of geography, law, and mythology into a sung narrative is a powerful parallel to the way European stories used landscapes as mnemonic anchors for legal boundaries, proving that different cultures can arrive at staggeringly similar solutions to the universal problem of preserving knowledge. Across the Pacific, numerous Native American nations possess rich oral history traditions that serve an identical purpose to the Icelandic sagas. The stories of the Lakota, the Apache, or the Haida are not just folklore. They are the living records of treaties, territorial rights, and ecological wisdom. A story about a battle long ago might precisely define the hunting grounds of a particular band. A tale about a marriage between a spirit from the mountains and a woman from the river might explain the complex web of kinship and alliance that governs social relations and resource sharing. These narratives were recited at gatherings, often by designated keepers of the tradition, ensuring that each generation understood not only their history but their legal and social obligations within the community. This practice of embedding law within story, of making the abstract tangible through dramatic narrative, is a direct mirror of the European tradition, suggesting a shared human understanding that the most effective way to make a rule stick is to wrap it in a compelling tale. A particularly striking example of this global parallel is found in the Maori concept of whakapapa. Much like the genealogical recitations of Anglo-Saxon bards, whakapapa is the foundational framework of Maori society. It is the intricate recitation of genealogy, but it is so much more than a list of names. Whakapapa traces descent all the way back to the gods and the very formation of the natural world, connecting an individual not only to their ancestors but to the mountains, rivers, and forests themselves. This creates an unbreakable chain of identity, responsibility, and rights. To recite your whakapapa is to state your claim to a place, your authority to speak on a matter, and your connection to everyone and everything around you. In legal disputes over land or fishing rights, the ability to accurately recite the relevant whakapapa is paramount evidence. This is precisely the same function served by the genealogical episodes in European epics, which were used to legitimize a ruler's authority and resolve inheritance conflicts. The convergence of such specific practices across vast oceans and completely isolated cultures is nothing short of astonishing. Recognizing these profound parallels does more than just satisfy historical curiosity. It fosters a deep and respectful cross-cultural appreciation. It allows us to see the medieval European memory code not as a peculiar artifact of a bygone era, but as one vibrant expression of a universal human impulse. This global viewpoint also sounds a critical alarm about the urgent importance of preservation. Just as the spread of literacy and print culture began to erode oral traditions in Europe, the forces of globalization, cultural assimilation, and modernization today threaten these priceless indigenous knowledge systems. When an elder who is the last keeper of a specific songline or a particular creation story passes away, it is not just a story that is lost. It is an entire chapter of a living, breathing legal and ecological encyclopedia that vanishes forever. The work of cultural preservation is therefore not a nostalgic hobby. It is the vital act of safeguarding irreplaceable libraries of human wisdom, libraries built not of books but of stories. But why was this method so incredibly effective? The answer lies deep within the architecture of the human mind itself. Storytelling is not merely a cultural invention. It is a fundamental feature of our cognitive wiring, a psychological superpower that our medieval ancestors learned to harness with breathtaking skill. When a bard began a saga, he wasn't just entertaining a crowd. He was conducting a symphony of neural activity inside every listener's head. Modern neuroscience has shown that when we hear a compelling narrative, our brains don't just process language. They light up as if we are actually living the events being described. The sensory cortex activates, allowing us to almost feel the chill of a Norse fjord or smell the smoke of a campfire. The motor cortex engages, mirroring the actions of a hero drawing a sword. Most importantly, a well-told story triggers a powerful release of neurochemicals. Dopamine, which aids in memory and motivation, is released as we anticipate what happens next. Cortisol surges during moments of tension and conflict, sharpening our focus. And oxytocin, the bonding chemical, flows during moments of empathy and connection, forging a powerful emotional link between the listener, the characters, and even the storyteller themselves. This biochemical cocktail is the secret engine of the memory code. It explains why a farmer could remember the precise description of a land boundary from a story he heard once a year at the winter feast. but might struggle to recall a simple list of instructions. Dry facts are processed in the hippocampus and then often discarded, but a story, rich with emotion and sensory detail, creates a multi-layered memory trace that is encoded across several regions of the brain simultaneously. This is known as neural coupling. The listener's brain activity actually starts to synchronize with the storyteller's pattern, creating a shared experience at a biological level. Furthermore, the narrative arc, the journey from a peaceful beginning through a challenging conflict to a satisfying resolution, provides a perfect structural scaffold for memory. Our minds are naturally primed to remember information that fits into a cause and effect sequence. A list of laws is arbitrary. A story about why a law was created, who it helped, and the chaos that ensued when it was broken, provides a logical and emotionally resonant framework that makes the information impossible to forget. This profound psychological impact also forged unbreakable bonds of identity and belonging. The stories a community shared about itself became the literal building blocks of its members' self-perception. When a young person heard tales of their ancestors' bravery, resilience, and loyalty, those values were not just learned intellectually, they were internalized as part of their own personal narrative. This process, known as narrative transportation, allows individuals to mentally enter a story world and emerge from it subtly changed, their attitudes and beliefs aligned with the themes of the tale. In a very real sense, the community was using storytelling as a tool for psychological cohesion, ensuring that everyone subscribed to a shared set of values and a common understanding of their history. This wasn't brainwashing. It was the most natural and powerful form of social learning ever devised, turning abstract ideals like honor and justice into core components of a person's identity, ensuring that the law wasn't just obeyed but truly lived by everyone. Throughout this journey, we have ventured deep into the heart of a world where memory was a monument and every story was a stone placed with purpose. We have walked the boundary lines sung by Norse Scalds and stood in the firelight of Celtic halls where the Fili recited laws not as dry statutes, but as living verse. We have seen how the human mind, in its brilliant ingenuity, transformed the entire landscape into a library and every epic poem into a legal constitution. This was not a primitive system. It was a sophisticated and elegant technology of the mind, a memory code so powerful it held entire civilizations together for centuries without the need for a single written ledger. From the intricate genealogies that wove the tapestry of identity to the heroic narratives that defined the very meaning of loyalty, these stories were the lifeblood of society. They were the living, breathing archives that preserved the most vital knowledge a community could possess. The emotional resonance of a well-told saga, the rhythmic cadence of a law recited in poetic form, the vivid imagery of a landscape imbued with meaning, these were the tools that made complex information unforgettable. They engaged not just the intellect but the heart and the senses, embedding the rules for living directly into the collective soul of the people. This was governance by narrative, a system where justice was a story everyone knew by heart. The gradual decline of these oral traditions with the rise of literacy and print culture was a trade-off of immense proportion. We gained the incredible efficiency, standardization, and reach of the written word, but we risked losing the rich, emotional context, the local nuance, and the deep community bonding that came from a shared story told aloud. The shift reminds us of the profound value in preserving diverse knowledge systems, especially those of indigenous and oral cultures around the world whose vast libraries of wisdom are held not in books, but in songs, stories, and ceremonies. Their erosion represents an irreplaceable loss to our global heritage. Yet, as we have seen, the principles of the medieval memory code are experiencing a remarkable and powerful revival. Modern neuroscience now confirms what our ancestors knew instinctively, that our brains are wired for narrative. This ancient understanding is now revolutionizing fields from education, where complex subjects are taught through story-based learning, to law, where a compelling case is still, at its core, a persuasive story told to a jury. The explosive growth of podcasts and digital storytelling is a testament to our enduring craving for spoken narrative, a return to the communal great hall in a new, globalized form. As we navigate our own information-saturated age, brimming with both unparalleled access to knowledge and the pervasive challenge of misinformation, the lessons of the medieval memory code are more relevant than ever. They teach us to be critical listeners, to question the sources and intentions behind the narratives we consume. They challenge us, as modern storytellers in our own right, to wield this power with integrity and purpose, to craft stories that build bridges of understanding rather than walls of division, that promote justice and foster genuine human connection. The stories we choose to tell today, the narratives we reinforce and share, will become the memories that shape tomorrow. They will define who we are, what we value, and the legacy we leave for the generations that will one day tell stories about us. Thank you for joining this exploration into the power of our past. We look forward to sharing more journeys into history